The two survived together on the streets until someone discovered who they really were. Nobody stopped. That was the rule on Fifth Avenue. Keep walking, look straight ahead, pretend the shadows don't exist. And for 3 years, the shadow of an old man and a golden dog had blended into the corner of 47th Street, so perfectly that most people had truly forgotten they were there. But on a cold Tuesday morning in November, a woman named Sarah Jennings did stop. She wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the dog, a large golden retriever, his fur matted and dull, his ribs faintly visible beneath the surface. Maybe it was the way the dog rested his enormous head on the old man's lap with a kind of devotion that felt almost sacred. Or maybe it was the old man's hands, rough, cracked, trembling slightly in the cold, gently stroking the dog's ears with a tenderness that seemed completely out of place on a city sidewalk. She took one step closer, then another. And then she saw it, a small cardboard sign, written in careful, educated handwriting that would change everything. His name is Captain. He saved my life. Now I am saving his. We are not asking for pity. We are just asking not to be invisible. Sarah took a photo. She almost didn't post it, but she did. And within 48 hours, that photo had been shared over 2 million times, because what no one knew, what the city had walked past for 3 years without ever bothering to ask, was exactly who this old man really was. A corner no one noticed. His name was Edward Calloway. He was 71 years old. He had a degree in civil engineering from MIT. He had once designed 2 of the bridges that the very people walking past him drove over every single day to get to their important jobs. He had a daughter he hadn't spoken to in 4 years. He had a past filled with things he was not proud of. Addiction, loss, pride that had turned to stubbornness. Stubbornness that had turned to ruin. He had sold everything to pay debts that kept growing. He had lost his apartment on a Friday and found himself on the street by the following Monday. And on that Monday, shivering outside a convenience store, wondering if he was going to survive the week, a dog had appeared. Not a puppy, not an energetic young animal. Captain was already 5 years old when he wandered out of an alley, limping on a back leg, a deep cut running across his side. Someone had hurt him. He had escaped. And for reasons neither of them could ever fully explain, he had walked straight up to Edward Calloway and sat down. Edward had nothing to give him. No food, no water, no shelter. He told Captain to go away. Captain didn't move. So Edward gave him the only thing he had. He tore a strip from his own jacket and wrapped it around the dog's wound. He sat beside him all night to keep him warm. And in the morning, Captain was still there. After that, they didn't separate, surviving together. Life on the street is brutal in ways that people who have never experienced it cannot fully imagine. It is not simply poverty. It is the accumulation of 1,000 small humiliations being moved along by security guards, being looked through rather than at, being cold in ways that burrow into your bones and stay there. Being hungry, not just in your stomach, but in your soul. Edward would later say that Captain was the reason he stayed alive through the first winter. Not metaphorically, literally. The dog's body heat kept Edward from hypothermia on 3 separate nights when the temperature dropped to dangerous lows. Edward would wrap his arms around Captain, and Captain would press himself as close as he could. And somehow, together, they would make it until morning. But Captain was also the reason people sometimes gave, not to Edward G., rarely directly to Edward, but to Captain. A child would pull her mother's sleeve. "Mama, the dog is hungry." And the mother, who might have walked past Edward alone, would stop. She might give food. She might give a few dollars. She might even look Edward in the eye for a moment and see a person instead of a problem. Captain made Edward visible, and Edward kept Captain alive. Edward learned which restaurants would leave food out the back on certain nights. He learned which shelters allowed dogs, very few, and which didn't, most. He walked away from warm beds countless times because they wouldn't take Captain, and Captain had no one else. He chose the street over warmth, over safety, over comfort, because loyalty, he had decided, was the only thing he had left worth keeping. If this story is moving you, share it. Someone in your life needs to be reminded that compassion can change everything, and that the people we walk past may carry more history than we know. Share this story now. What Sarah found when she asked? When Sarah Jennings crouched down on that November morning, she didn't just take a photo. She also asked a question, a simple one, the kind most people had never bothered to ask. What's your story? Edward looked at her with quiet suspicion, the look of a man who had been used before, whose story had been taken and reshaped into something unrecognizable. But there was something in her face that made him answer. Maybe exhaustion. Maybe the faintest thread of hope. He talked for almost an hour. He told her about the bridges he had designed, about the accident that had shattered his hip and begun his slide into painkillers, about his wife, Marie, who had died of cancer while he was still using, about his daughter, Rebecca, who had handed him an ultimatum one afternoon, and whom he had chosen, in his fog, to lose, about the night he had stood at the edge of a bridge, one of his own bridges, and Captain had pressed against his legs so hard that he had stepped back from the railing. Sarah listened to all of it. When he was done, she asked if she could take the photo. She said yes. The photographer, a young woman named Sarah, posted the picture with a caption that read, "He designed bridges. He lost everything. He chose his dog over a warm bed every single night for 3 years. His name is Edward. His dog is Captain. They've been invisible long enough." And just like that, Edward and Captain were no longer invisible. The Internet, with its infinite capacity for both cruelty and connection, did something extraordinary. The photo and its story exploded. 2 million shares. It spread through local networks, then Geggenau, then national engineers shared it. Veterans shared it. Parents shared it. People who had wrestled with their own demons shared it with trembling hands. The world saw a man, not just a statistic on a street corner. Among the millions who saw the post was a structural engineering firm in Boston. Decades ago, they had worked alongside Edward on a major highway project. The firm's senior partner, Dr. Linda Park, recognized his name. She picked up the phone, but that wasn't all. A reporter in New Jersey saw the story and recognized one of the bridges Edward had mentioned. He started digging through public records. What did he find? Design patents, commendations, the quiet, documented proof that this man, sleeping on a corner of 47th Street, had built the very infrastructure that thousands of people relied on every single day without a second thought. And then Rebecca saw it. Edward's daughter, 34 years old, a teacher living all the way across the country in Portland. She hadn't spoken to her father in 4 long years. She had built a wall of silence, convincing herself it was necessary for her own protection. She told herself that her father had made his choices, and she had made hers. But then she saw his face in that photo. She saw Captain's head resting faithfully on his lap, and she saw the sign, his plea to not be invisible anymore. That evening, she booked a flight to New York. Rebecca arrived on a Thursday. Sarah, the photographer who had stayed in touch with Edward, brought her to the corner. Edward had no idea she was coming. When he saw her walking towards him, he stood up slowly, his bad hip protesting. For a long, silent moment, they just looked at each other. Captain stood up too, alert, watching this stranger who was making his human's face do something complicated and new. But Rebecca didn't go to her father first. She crouched down to the dog. She scratched Captain behind the ears, just like her dad taught her when she was a little girl. Captain leaned into a touch immediately, his tail sweeping back and forth in slow, serious wags. "He likes you," Edward said, his voice rough with disuse and emotion. "He has good taste," she replied, finally looking up. "Hi, Dad." He sat back down on the cold ground, and she sat right beside him in her nice coat on the gritty concrete. They stayed there for a long time, just sitting together, and Captain, the loyal friend who started it all, settled across both their laps, a heavy, warm bridge connecting to worlds that had been separated for far too long. He knew, with absolute certainty, that this was exactly where he was supposed to be. Stories like Edward's remind us of the power of seeing one another, truly seeing the humanity in everyone. Thank you so much for watching. If this story touched you, please give it a like and consider subscribing for more content that matters. See you next time. The engineering firm in Boston offered Edward a consulting contract, part-time, remote, a chance to review younger engineers' designs and offer feedback. It was not a return to his former life. It was something smaller and, in some ways, more honest. A housing nonprofit in New York, moved by the story, worked with Sarah to find Edward and Captain an apartment in a building that permitted dogs. It was small. It had a radiator that clanged at night and a window that looked out onto a brick wall. Edward said it was the most beautiful place he had ever lived. He and Rebecca began the slow, difficult work of rebuilding their relationship. They spoke by phone every Sunday. Some calls were short, some were painful, a few were, against all expectation, full of laughter. There is no clean resolution to years of pain, but there is sometimes a beginning. Captain, for his part, adapted to indoor life with remarkable ease, as though he had simply been waiting for it all along. He developed a fondness for sleeping in a specific patch of afternoon sunlight near the window. He ate well. His fur, with care, became soft again. The limp faded almost entirely. Edward took him for a walk every morning, past the corner of 47th Street. He always stopped there for a moment. He said it was to remember what it felt like to be invisible, so that he would never forget to look at the people others were walking past. What this story is really about. It would be easy to read this story as a fairy tale, a happy ending made possible by a viral photo and the kindness of strangers, and there is truth in that. Kindness did matter here. Visibility mattered. The act of one woman stopping and asking a question mattered enormously. But Edward Calloway is not a fairy tale. He is a real accounting of what happens when systems fail. When pride and illness and grief combine into a collapse that society is too impatient to understand. For every Edward whose story goes viral, there are thousands whose stories never reach anyone who remain invisible. Not because they have nothing to say, but because no one has stopped to listen. Captain is also not a symbol. He is a dog who was hurt and who found someone willing to be hurt alongside him, and who gave back everything he had in return. There is no complicated lesson in that. It is simply what loyalty looks like when it has nothing left to prove. What the story asks of us is not pity, Edward said to himself on his little cardboard sign. It asks for the slightly harder thing: presence, attention, the willingness to stop, even for a moment, and see. The people we walk past have names, they have histories, they have, in many cases, built things, relationships, careers, children, ideas that still exist in the world, still matter even if the builders themselves have been forgotten. Sometimes all it takes is one person who stops. One question, one photo, one moment of being seen. Edward knew this better than anyone. He had spent 3 years on that corner, watching the world walk by, having already given up hope that anyone would stop. And then someone did. If this story stayed with you, please share it. Not everyone will have a viral moment, but everyone deserves to be seen. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that kindness is always worth the detour. And if you know someone struggling, reach out today. Don't wait for a photo. Just stop and ask, what's your story? For every Edward and every Captain still waiting on a corner somewhere. May someone stop